It was a crisp Monday morning in Ouagadougou, the capital city of Burkina Faso. The sun peeked over the skyline, casting a warm golden glow over the rooftops. At the presidential palace, the guards stood tall, vigilant as President Ibrahim Traoré stepped outside in a simple dark brown shirt and trousers. He looked calm but purposeful. Unlike the usual routine of meetings and heavy schedules, today felt different. President Traoré had a plan, one he had kept to himself, shared with no one but his driver. "I want to visit the central prison," he told the driver. "No media, no press, just me, and I want to see how the prisoners are living." The driver, startled but silent, didn't ask any questions. He simply nodded and started the car. The presidential vehicle left the palace, escorted by just 2 unmarked police cars. Around 40 minutes later, they stopped outside Ouagadougou's largest prison, the Central Correctional Facility. The place was dusty, with high gray walls topped with barbed wire. The guards at the gate were taken aback when they saw who was in the car. The president of the country, standing at the gates, like a regular citizen? "Mr. President," one of the guards stammered, quickly opening the gates. "We weren't informed." "I know," President Traoré replied firmly. "That's why I'm here. Take me inside." The prison warden, a short man named Monsieur Pascal, rushed forward, sweat dripping down his face. "Sir, if we had known, we would have prepared." "I'm not here for preparations," the president said, walking past him. "Take me to the prisoners. I want to speak to them." Confused but obedient, Pascal led him down a narrow hallway filled with the sounds of distant coughing, shouting, and sorrow. The air was thick with the stench of dust, sweat, and despair. As they entered the main prison block, hundreds of inmates stopped what they were doing. Some were playing cards on the floor, others were lying down, looking worn out. A few were praying quietly. But one by one they stood up, confused and surprised by the unexpected visitor. The president greeted each one humbly, shaking hands and asking them about their lives. "How long have you been here? What crime were you accused of? Do you have family?" Most prisoners responded in fear, unsure whether this was some kind of trap or a miracle. But the president listened patiently, meeting their eyes with respect and kindness. After an hour of speaking with the prisoners, something caught President Traoré's attention. He noticed a man sitting quietly in the corner of a small dark cell. Unlike the others, this man didn't speak, didn't stand. His head was bowed, his face tired, and his eyes looked as if he had lost everything. The president approached him and asked, "What's your name?" The man looked up slowly, his eyes filled with sadness. "Emanuel," he replied in a soft voice. "How long have you been here, Emanuel?" 7 years, sir." "What was your crime?" Emanuel paused before answering. "They say I stole money from my boss, but I didn't. I worked for him for years. He wanted to get rid of me and hire his nephew, so he accused me. I didn't have a lawyer. No one believed me. I'm poor." The president looked deep into Emanuel's eyes. There was no anger or bitterness in his face, just a quiet pain, the kind that comes from being abandoned and wrongly judged. "Why didn't you appeal?" "I tried," Emanuel whispered, "but I had no money. My wife left me. My kids were taken away. No one came to visit me." A deep silence settled in the room. Even the other prisoners and the guards grew quiet. Everyone could see that the president was moved. "I believe you, Emanuel," President Traoré said, standing there for a long moment before speaking again, "and I'll find out the truth." Turning to the guards, he gave a firm order. "Bring me his case file before the end of the day. I want every detail. Who arrested him, who judged the case, who was the accuser, everything." The guards answered quickly, "Yes, sir." Then the president turned to Emanuel and said, "Your story is not over. I give you my word." As President Traoré walked out of the prison block, a heavy silence hung in the air. Every prisoner stood still, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Something had changed. Hope, which had been buried for so long, started to flicker again. Outside, the president turned to his driver and said, "Cancel all my meetings today. I'm going to the Ministry of Justice." The driver hesitated for a moment. "But, sir, no excuses," President Traoré interrupted. "A man's life is waiting." With that, the presidential vehicle sped away, not just carrying the leader of the country, but a mission for justice. At the Ministry of Justice, President Traoré sat in his office, the hum of the air conditioner the only sound breaking the silence. His thoughts were consumed with Emanuel's face. The pain in his eyes was impossible to shake off. He had shaken hands with thousands of powerful people throughout his life, but there was something different about Emanuel. It was as if his story had unsettled the very core of Traoré's being. "Get me the Chief Justice," he said to his aide, voice steady but firm. The aide nodded quickly and rushed out of the room. Moments later, Justice Minister Duff arrived, adjusting his tie nervously. He could tell that something serious was unfolding. "Mr. President, you asked to see me urgently?" Duff asked, trying to maintain his composure. "Yes," Traoré replied without hesitation. "This morning I visited Ouagadougou Central Prison. I met a man named Emanuel. He's been locked away for 7 years for a crime he says he didn't commit." Duff hesitated, his eyes darting away before he spoke. "Sir, the courts failed him," President Traoré interjected sharply. "I want to reopen his case. I need to know everything. Who arrested him, who judged him, and why he didn't have any legal support." "Mr. President, this is not just about Emanuel," Duff said, lowering his voice. "This is about how many more people might be suffering in silence." Traoré's eyes grew intense. "Exactly. Yes, I know. I'll personally look into his case," Duff promised, but the weight of the task was already clear. "No," President Traoré countered. "I need an independent team. No politics, no games. We need truth, not just answers." Minutes later, a team of lawyers, human rights officers, and investigators was assembled, tasked with digging through Emanuel's case. What they uncovered was shocking. The case had been handled by a corrupt judge, one who had been dismissed years ago for taking bribes. Emanuel's employer, a wealthy businessman named Laurent Gira, had used his influence to rush the trial. Emanuel had no lawyer, and the only evidence against him was a signed confession he claimed was forced out of him. "This is appalling," one of the officers remarked. "The whole trial was rigged." That evening, President Traoré sat in his office, reviewing the full report. He read through every detail with growing disbelief. When he finished, he closed the file with a deep sigh, whispering, "I knew he was telling the truth." The next morning, President Traoré went back to the prison. This time, cameras and reporters followed him. The whole nation watched in shock as the president walked into Emanuel's cell, his expression filled with resolve. "Emanuel," President Traoré began, his voice warm, "I've reviewed your case. You were not only wrongly accused, but you were abandoned by a system that should have protected you. I'm sorry." Emanuel blinked in confusion. "Sir, you are going home," President Traoré said, his voice steady and firm. Gasps rippled through the room. Emanuel's eyes widened. "Is this real?" he asked softly, tears welling up. "Yes," President Traoré affirmed. "You're a free man now." As Emanuel stepped outside, a crowd had gathered. He looked thinner, older, and uncertain. He held no belongings, nothing but the clothes on his back. But the sunlight that bathed him was different from the one that had shone on him 7 years ago. Reporters swarmed around him. "How do you feel, sir? What will you do now?" Emanuel stared at his hands for a moment before glancing up at the sky. "I don't know," he replied quietly. "I have no family, no home, no job. But I have hope, and that's enough for now." President Traoré placed a hand on Emanuel's shoulder. "You are not alone," he said. He took Emanuel into his car and drove him to the presidential guest house. For the first time in years, Emanuel bathed with clean water, ate a real meal, and slept on a soft bed. The following day, President Traoré invited Emanuel to the palace. "I want to hear everything," the president said. "Your childhood, your job, your dreams." Emanuel shared his story, growing up in a small village, working as a clerk, marrying young, and how everything fell apart when he was arrested. "I wanted to be a teacher," he said. "But life had other plans." President Traoré nodded thoughtfully. "Your life has changed again, and this time you're in charge." Emanuel smiled. A faint but genuine smile, the first one he'd had in years. That afternoon, President Traoré called a press conference. He stood before the cameras, his voice steady as he addressed the nation. "Today, we correct a mistake. But this is not just about one man. We must fix a broken system. No citizen should suffer in silence. I will not rest until our justice system protects the innocent and punishes the guilty fairly." He turned to Emanuel, who stood beside him, still wearing borrowed clothes, his hands shaking with the enormity of the moment. "Meet Emanuel. He is not a criminal. He is a survivor, and he is now part of a new task force to help us investigate other wrongful imprisonments across the country." The crowd erupted into applause, and Emanuel's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of hope. It was the beginning of something bigger than just his release, a movement for justice in the country. The news spread across Burkina Faso like wildfire. Every radio station, newspaper, and television channel carried the same headline: President Traoré frees innocent man after surprise prison visit. But for President Traoré, Emanuel's release was just the first step. Call for a national audit, he instructed Minister Duff the next morning. I want the files of every prisoner who has served more than 5 years, especially those without legal support. Yes, sir, Duff replied, though he looked overwhelmed by the magnitude of the task. That's a massive undertaking. Then we must start now, Traoré said firmly. One innocent person in jail is one too many. Meanwhile, Emanuel was adjusting to life in the presidential guest house. But he didn't feel like a guest. He felt like a stranger in a world that had moved on without him. Everything had changed while he was locked away. The roads, the technology, even the way people spoke. It all felt faster, louder, and overwhelming. One evening he sat alone in the garden behind the guest house, watching the sunset. A young aide named Joseph approached, offering a notebook and a pen. The president thought you might want to write your story, Joseph said. Monument nodded slowly and opened the notebook. On the first page he wrote 7 years in silence. He stared at the words for a long time before writing anything else. The next day, President Traoré invited him to a special meeting at the Ministry of Justice. Around a large table sat senior lawyers, prison officers, and human rights representatives. They were all there to hear Emanuel's story. Today, the president began, we are going to listen to the unheard. He turned to Emanuel. Please, speak. They need to hear your story. Emanuel stood slowly, taking a deep breath as he surveyed the room. I was 28 when I was arrested. I was accused by the man I had worked for 8 years. No one asked for my side of the story. I was beaten. I was forced to sign a confession I didn't write. At the trial, I stood alone. The judge didn't ask me any questions. He just read the charges and declared me guilty. I was sent to prison for 15 years. He paused for a moment, his voice trembling. In prison, I lost everything. My wife sent me divorce papers. My children stopped writing. My friends vanished. I tried to hold on, but every day felt like dying slowly. The room was silent. Even the most powerful officials couldn't bring themselves to meet his gaze. I'm not here to blame anyone, Emanuel continued. I'm here to ask how many more people are out there like me. Who will speak for them? President Traoré clapped, and slowly everyone in the room joined in. Not because they were told to, but because they were moved by his words. From that moment on, Emanuel became more than just a symbol of injustice. He became a voice for the voiceless. The president appointed him to head a new committee, the Justice Review Task Force. Their job was to visit prisons, listen to the inmates, and find others like Emanuel who had been wrongfully imprisoned. Their first stop was a smaller prison in Bobo Dioulasso. Though smaller than the Ouagadougou facility, it was just as overcrowded. Emanuel, now wearing a white shirt with a Justice for All badge, walked through the gates confidently. Inside, he met a man named Isidore, who had been imprisoned for 12 years on a charge of armed robbery. However, there was no evidence, no witnesses, no fingerprints, no weapon. Why are you still here? Emanuel asked gently. Isidore's eyes welled with tears. Because I have no one, and no one believes me. I believe you, Emanuel said. The same words President Traoré had once said to him, and I will help you. Back in the capital, President Traoré was working harder than ever. He met with judges, police officials, and legal experts. He ordered training programs to help police understand human rights better. He told judges that rushing cases without proper evidence would no longer be tolerated. This is not a favor, he told them sternly, it's a duty. In the weeks that followed, Emanuel's team uncovered 27 other prisoners who had been unjustly held. Some had no case files at all, while others had completed their sentences but had never been released due to errors in documentation. At every prison, Emanuel walked tall, no longer just a former inmate, but a symbol of what could be done when someone was willing to fight for the forgotten. His painful past had turned into his driving force. During a private meeting at the palace, President Traoré sat with a group of newly freed prisoners. Tell me, he asked, what would you do if you were given a second chance? One man replied, I would become a teacher. I want to help children understand their rights. Another said, I want to farm. I want to grow food and feed people. Emanuel smiled at both. Then do it. And do it well. Let your freedom speak louder than your silence. Determined to make a real difference, President Traoré went further. He announced the creation of the Freedom Restoration Fund, a program to assist former prisoners, especially those who had been wrongfully imprisoned, with education, housing, and employment. "Many of these men have no homes to return to," he said in a televised address. "Their lives have been stolen, and we must give back what we can, not as a favor, but as justice." The response from the public was overwhelming. For the first time in decades, the government was taking tangible action on justice, not just talking about it. As the campaign gained momentum, journalists from across the globe came to see the changes unfolding in Burkina Faso. International human rights organizations praised the country for its bold reforms. But, as expected, with the praise came resistance. Behind closed doors, some powerful officials weren't happy with the changes. "This campaign is making the Justice Department look incompetent," one official complained. "People are going to think everyone in jail is innocent." President Traoré heard these complaints but didn't waver. In a national address, he responded firmly, "Let me be clear. Justice is not about protecting our pride. It is about correcting our wrongs. If the system is broken, we must fix it, no matter how uncomfortable that may be." His words silenced many critics. Prisoners greeted him with respect, but more importantly, with newfound confidence. They no longer looked like men who had given up. A young inmate, Salo, approached him. "Mr. President, I just want to say thank you. I'm still serving time, but now I believe someone is listening." President Traoré shook his hand. "Everyone deserves a voice, and as long as I'm president, no one will be left in the dark." Back at the palace, Emanuel received a letter from a man named Austin, a former prosecutor who had overseen over 300 cases during his career. "I want to confess," the letter began. "I was forced to convict people I wasn't sure were guilty. I want to help you now." Emanuel took the letter to President Traoré, who read it carefully before nodding with a slight smile. "Then let him come. It's time for justice to come from both sides, the hurt and the healer." As Operation Justice Light entered its third month, the chains were breaking not only in prison cells, but also in hearts, minds, and laws. President Traoré's leadership was no longer just about freeing the wrongly accused. It was about creating a new system, one built on fairness, transparency, and humanity. When President Traoré stood before the National Assembly, his words carried the weight of his mission. "We are not freeing criminals. We are freeing truth. Let no man sleep peacefully while another suffers wrongly." Burkina Faso was awakening, and it was beginning with justice. The streets of Ouagadougou buzzed with conversations. From crowded markets to quiet homes, from schools to late-night radio stations, everyone was talking about the president's justice reforms. Families who had long given up hope now had reason to believe. But as Operation Justice Light continued to uncover more cases of wrongful imprisonment, deeper and more dangerous roots began to surface. Some of the people involved in past convictions were powerful: judges, politicians, business tycoons. And one name, in particular, caught Emanuel's attention: Laurent Gira, the man who had falsely accused him 7 years ago. Emanuel was sitting in his office at the Justice Review Task Force, flipping through a list of pending cases when he saw it again. His heart sank. Laurent Gira. It was the same name that had destroyed his life all those years ago. The man who had falsely accused him. The man who had manipulated the justice system to get rid of him. He froze. "It's him," he whispered. His assistant, noticing the sudden shift in Emanuel's expression, looked up. "Who?" Emanuel clenched the file in his hands. "Laurent Gira. He's still at it, framing innocent people." Emanuel hurried into President Traoré's office, holding the file tightly against his chest. He didn't even bother to knock. "I'm sorry to interrupt, sir," he said breathlessly, "but you need to see this." President Traoré took the file from him and read the name aloud, his frown deepening. "Laurent Gira?" "Yes," Emanuel confirmed. "He's still doing it, framing innocent people just like he did to me, and he's got the system in his pocket." Traoré stood up slowly, eyes locked on Emanuel. His voice was calm, but determined. "Then we stop him." That very day, President Traoré established a special commission to investigate Laurent Gira and his business, Guerrero Enterprises. The task force was made up of independent lawyers, senior police officials, and investigative journalists. They worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. Within a week, the findings were damning. The evidence was clear: falsified documents, forged witness reports, and a long history of complaints from former employees who had been wrongfully imprisoned or silenced. One former security guard, Pascal, shared his experience in an emotional testimony. "They told me to sign a confession or they would kill my wife," Pascal said, his voice shaking. "I was scared, so I signed it." Another former worker, Awa, had been imprisoned for 3 years just for exposing the company's illegal labor practices. When President Traoré read the final report, he shook his head in disbelief. This man has built his empire on the pain of others. At a press conference, Traoré held the report high in the air, declaring, "This is not justice, this is failure, this cannot continue." The next morning, Laurent Gira was arrested. The news was shocking to the country. Gira, once hailed as a successful businessman and pillar of the national economy, was now exposed as a manipulator of the justice system. Emanuel watched the arrest quietly from the sidelines. He didn't cheer, and he didn't cry. He felt a strange peace inside, a quiet sense of justice finally being served. "Justice," he whispered to himself, "at last." During the trial, Laurent Gira refused to speak at first, but as witness after witness stepped forward, as forged documents were examined, the truth became undeniable. Even the judge who had sentenced Emanuel was summoned. The judge, once a respected figure, admitted under the weight of public scrutiny, "Yes, I took money. I was promised a promotion. I failed the law. I failed the people." The courtroom fell silent. Emanuel, sitting in the front row beside President Traoré, could feel the weight of the moment. The judge turned to him and said, "I ruined your life. I do not ask for forgiveness. I only ask that you never let this happen again." Emanuel stood up slowly, his voice calm but unwavering. "You took 7 years from me, but you taught me something. Justice must be protected, not by the powerful, but by the brave." The courtroom erupted into applause. 2 days later, the ruling was announced. Laurent Gira was sentenced to 18 years in prison. The judge, who had been complicit in the scheme, was dismissed and stripped of all honors. Victims like Pascal and Awa received state compensation, and Emanuel was finally declared a man of honor by the National Assembly. President Traoré gave a speech to mark the occasion. "This is a new dawn. Let the powerful know your titles will not shield you from justice, and let the poor know you are not invisible. We see you, we hear you, and we will fight for you." Across Burkina Faso, the people rejoiced. For the first time in generations, justice was not just a word, it was an action, a movement. Emanuel, now known as the voice of the voiceless, was invited to speak at universities, conferences, and schools across the nation. He taught young people about their rights, about law, and about the power of truth. But he remained humble. "I am not a hero," he would often say. "I am just one of many. My story could have been forgotten, but someone listened, and that changed everything." One quiet afternoon, after a long day of work, Emanuel returned to the prison where it all began. He walked through the familiar hallways and sat with inmates still serving their sentences. "Do not lose hope," he told them gently. "Even silence can be broken. Your voice matters. Keep speaking. Someone will hear you." That evening, President Traoré called Emanuel. "There's more work ahead," he said. "The justice system is like a garden. If we stop caring for it, weeds will grow again." Emanuel nodded, "And we must keep planting seeds of truth." And so the mission continued, not just to free the wrongly accused, but to rebuild a nation where justice lived in every home, every village, and every heart. 1 year had passed since President Traoré had stepped into that dusty prison and met Emanuel, the man with sad eyes and a quiet spirit. Burkina Faso was no longer the same. The justice system had been shaken, cleaned, and reborn. But perhaps the greatest transformation was not in the laws or prisons. It was in the heart of a man once forgotten by the world. Emanuel was no longer just a name in a dusty prison logbook. He had become a national voice, a teacher, and a partner in governance. President Traoré saw in him something rare, humility mixed with strength, pain turned into power. One morning, over a quiet breakfast at the palace, the president leaned forward and said, "I have one final proposal for you, Emanuel. I want you to become special advisor on national justice and human rights. You will work directly with me, not just for prisoners, but for every voiceless citizen in this country." Meanwhile, President Traoré received international praise for his bold reforms. Leaders from across Africa came to learn from Burkina Faso's prison audit model. Human rights organizations applauded the courage it took to expose internal corruption. But the president remained humble. "I did not do it alone," he said in an interview. "I was led by a man the world once ignored. Now he leads with me." On the first anniversary of Operation Justice Light, a national event was held at the Capitol Stadium. President Traoré and Emanuel stood before thousands. Around them were hundreds of former prisoners who had been freed and supported back into society. Each wore a white sash with the words, "Justice Restored." One by one, they stepped forward to share how their lives had changed. Some had opened farms. Others had become teachers, mechanics, and leaders in their communities. They were no longer marked by the years they lost, but by the futures they had built. Emanuel gave the closing speech. He stood silently for a moment, looking out at the sea of faces. Then he spoke. "I once thought my life was over. I once thought silence was my only companion. But today I stand here not as a victim, but as a partner in rebuilding justice. I forgive those who hurt me. I thank the one who listened, and I challenge every one of you. Listen to the unheard. Stand for the unseen. Speak for the voiceless. Because justice is not a luxury, it is a right, and together we must protect it." The stadium erupted in cheers. Tears flowed freely. That night, people across Burkina Faso lit candles in their homes, celebrating Justice Day for the first time in the nation's history. Back at the palace, President Traoré and Emanuel sat in quiet reflection. "You've done well," the president said. "No," Emanuel replied, smiling. "We have done well." And in that silence, two men unseparated by position and pain sat as equals, not as president and prisoner, but as brothers in purpose bound by truth. The next morning, Emanuel returned to his old cell at Ouagadougou Central Prison, not as a prisoner, but as a guest of honor. The cell had been left untouched since his release. A small plaque now hung on the wall. This cell once held a man the world forgot, but it also held the spark that set justice free. Emanuel closed the cell door gently behind him, stepped into the sunlight, and walked into a future he had once never imagined. The chains were broken. The truth had come out. And Burkina Faso would never be the same again. If this story inspiring to you, like and subscribe for more.